is Professor Stephanie Barclay. I'm an associate professor of law at Notre Dame Law School, where I also direct the law school's new religious liberty initiative. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about why religious liberty is beneficial for the common good. That's true in our country. It's also true in other countries. I'll talk about a few different reasons why I think religious liberty is really important, and then I'll also address an important counterargument. One reason why I think religious liberty is really critical for the common good is that it makes it possible for people to find ways to peacefully dissent on some of the issues that are going to be most important for them. This creates a safety valve that decreases conflict and increases the ability of groups of all different sorts of beliefs and faiths to live side by side in peace. There have been studies that have shown that countries that provide more religious freedom have less internal conflict. Better national security outcomes are achieved for those countries. There are even economic benefits when there's less conflict in a country. And another reason that I think religious liberty is really important is because protecting this freedom and paying attention to this freedom can often act as an early warning system for when government starts to intrude too much when it comes to individual liberties across the board. In other words, religious people, because they so jealously are guarding their ability to practice their religion, can often act like a canary in the mine shaft that will sound an alarm when government is starting to take away too much freedom that impacts other groups and areas of the law as well, but that might not be noticed as quickly. Third, religious freedom is a basic human right. It's part of what it means to have dignity as an individual, to be able to pursue our deepest truth and to pursue it authentically, whether that leads one to a place of faith or whether it leads them to no place at all. Religious freedom creates the space between government and individuals in terms of freedom to make it possible for individuals to pursue those animating beliefs that are going to make life most meaningful, a good life worth living for individuals. The fact that I think it's important also to talk a little bit about what do we mean when we discuss religious freedom. I'll start by telling you what I don't mean and what I don't think any scholars or advocates in this space mean. No one is advocating that religious freedom ought to give individuals a blank check to do whatever they want, and all they have to do is raise their hand and say, my religion made me do it, and then they have a get out of the law free card. That's not really something that is plausible or would lead to the type of good society I was talking about before, or that anyone thinks is reasonable. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other hand, there are some folks who I think take far too narrow of a view of religious freedom and say that religious freedom just means the right not to be persecuted for your religious beliefs. In other words, to live in a world in which the government isn't singling you out and mistreating you specifically because it disagrees with your religious beliefs. Now, I agree that's a really important aspect of religious freedom, but I think our common good in society, just social welfare and benefits generally, are increased more when we think of religious freedom more broadly than that. Specifically, where the rubber often meets the road in religious freedom cases is when it comes to situations where government isn't intentionally trying to harm religious freedom, but that just happens to be an incidental consequence, or maybe not incidental, maybe it was foreseen, but the government is just indifferent to it in ways that the government would be less indifferent towards other more powerful political actors. And there's a negative consequence for religious individuals. Their ability to voluntarily exercise their faith is constricted. There are penalties or other sorts of coercive impacts from government that they might face if they pursue their faith. So what do we do in those sorts of situations? Well, there's a couple different approaches that people recommend, but I think that the one that will most benefits the common good, both in the United States and in other countries, is to require the government to actually have a justification that the government proves through an evidentiary burden to explain why, in a particular case, it needs to burden religious freedom to accomplish whatever goals the government is saying are important. There will be some cases where the government does have worthy goals worth pursuing, and there's really no better way to accomplish them other than restricting an individual's religious freedom. Consider, for example, cases where religious individuals claimed that they had the right to beat their children because of their religious beliefs. Unsurprisingly, courts have made short order of those sorts of claims and have ruled against those sorts of arguments, because that's an area where the government has a laudable goal of preventing child abuse, and there's no other way to accomplish it in that case other than to prevent the religious exercise at issue, which is the desire to inflict harm on those children. There's a lot of other cases, though, where when government really looks hard at the issue, if it wants to, it can find ways to accomplish its goal while still protecting the religious liberty of individuals and institutions. So, for example, in a case that I have been involved in litigating, and I wrote an article about, it's being published in the Harvard Law Review, dealing with sacred sites for Indigenous peoples. There was a highway project in Oregon where the government was engaged in an expansion of the highway. The government had a lot of different ways that it could have expanded this highway, and it used those tools in different settings. A particular conflict arose because in one spot where the government was expanding the highway, the government's proposed construction plans would have destroyed a sacred burial ground of different tribal members, a place where religious ceremonies by Native Americans continued to be performed. There was a stone altar involved in those ceremonies, an ancient stone altar that government archaeologists had observed and noted. We don't even know the date where that altar comes from. And there were old growth sacred trees in this area. Really small area, but right off of the highway. And in this case, the government could have expanded the highway on the opposite side, or it could have built a retaining wall so that it protected the sacred space more while still expanding the highway. Or it could have had a different grade of the highway that it used in constructing so that it destroyed less of the religious area. The government used none of those options, and it used the most destructive option, which resulted in it bulldozing the entire area where the ceremonies were performed, or where this Native American sacred grave site had existed. They bulldozed it, they scattered the rocks of the ancient stone altar, they cut down the old growth trees, and they removed the access to this site. This is a case where if government doesn't have to justify why it's burdening religious exercise, there's nothing to stop the government from doing things exactly like that. On the other hand, if we ask the government to look hard at whether it has options to do what it wants to do, like expand a road, while still protecting religious exercise, that would lead to better outcomes for society. Why? Because the government isn't diminished in its ability to still do things that it is arguing are good for public welfare. But religious individuals are able to have their religious exercise as well, which increases their public welfare. That's a net benefit for everyone. One important argument that often arises in the context of religious liberty is this argument that we should restrict religious freedom whenever freedom of religion is going to diminish or the rights of someone else, or result in harm for someone else. Sort of goes back to the old saying, my right to swing my fist ends when it hits your nose. So this is the conventional wisdom in a lot of different circles. The problem is that economists have long recognized, including Nobel Peace winning economist Ronald Coase, that anytime we protect a legal interest, including something like a constitutional right, there will always be harm from that protection that flows to others. Cass Sunstein and David Holmes have written a book called The Cost of Rights recently that explores this very idea in greater depth. Anytime as a society we decide to set aside a right as important, there is always what's called a reciprocal externality. So if the rule is that we're only going to protect rights as long as they don't result in harm for others, what that really means is we're not going to protect rights. The better question, I think, if we're looking at this through a lens where harm is an important criteria, is to ask which result is going to reduce net harm for society. In other words, which result is going to make it so that the least amount of people are harmed, or the harm that we're dealing with is the least serious type of harm. So if we go back to the slockish example, the government might argue that there was a little bit more headache or expense involved in expanding its highway to the other side. I'm not even sure it would be able to prove that claim, but it could argue that claim. But a counterargument is, sure, but that small expense makes it possible for Indigenous peoples to still be able to go practice their religious exercise and continue a really important aspect of their identity and who they are. Elsewhere in economic theory, generally, we're pretty cautious about allowing the government to force people to give up things that are important to them. So, for example, if someone came to you and said, I want to buy your house, I had it appraised, and I'm willing to offer the appraised value, so now you have to sell your house to me. Generally, the law doesn't allow that to happen, in part because of the risk that people have what's called idiosyncratic valuations, or they value really highly a thing, maybe more highly than the market value would suggest, for sentimental reasons, for emotional reasons. You really like your backyard, you like your neighbors, you just don't want to deal with the hassle of moving. And so the law usually allows people to decide when they want to part with this thing that is valuable to them. It's interesting to think about religious liberty in the same way. At the founding of our nation, we had some laws that required individuals to participate in military service through a draft. For most people, this wasn't fun, but it was something that they were willing to comply with when they compared the consequence of different sorts of penalties, including possibly going to jail. But there was one group that didn't respond in the same way as most other people, and that was Quakers. Quakers were not willing to go to war because they valued more highly, for religious reasons, their ability to maintain a posture of peace than other individuals did. If you will, Quakers had an idiosyncratic value on this religious belief. What we recognized as a society, what James Madison and other founding fathers at the time spoke about, is the fact that there wasn't really any justice or benefit in sending Quakers to jail, because it didn't actually improve our national security or our military goals. It's not as though that made it more likely that they were actually going to fight. It just resulted in more human suffering. So I would submit to you that one of the important driving purposes of religious liberty is to recognize these sorts of idiosyncratic ideals that are animating religious people. At least they will always seem idiosyncratic to folks who don't share that faith, and to protect them so that we can have less human suffering, better common welfare for everyone. Thank you.